Talmanes tugged on Selfar's reins, making the horse dance and shake his head. The roan seemed eager. Perhaps Selfar sensed his master's anxious mood. The night air was thick with smoke. Smoke and screams. Talmanes marched the band alongside a road clogged with refugees, smudged with soot. They moved like the flotsam in a muddy river. The men of the band eyed the refugees with worry. "Steady," Talmanes shouted to them. "We can't sprint all the way to Camelin. Steady!" He marched the men as quickly as he dared, nearly at a jog. Their armor clanked. Elaine had taken half of the band with her to the Field of Merrilor, including Estion and most of the cavalry. Perhaps she had anticipated needing to withdraw quickly. Well, Talmanes wouldn't have much use for cavalry in the streets, which were no doubt as clogged as this roadway. Selfar snorted and shook his head. They were close now. The city walls just ahead, black in the night, held in an angry light. It was as if the city were a fire pit. By grace and banners fallen, Talmanes thought with a shiver. Enormous clouds of smoke billowed over the city. This was bad, far worse than when the Aiel had come for Cairhien. Talmanes finally gave Selfar his head. The roan galloped along the side of the road for a time. Then Talmanes reluctantly forced his way across, ignoring pleas for help. Time he'd spent with Matt made him wish there were more he could offer these people. It was downright strange, the effect Matrim Cawthon had on a person. Talmanes looked at common folk in a very different light now. Perhaps it was because he still didn't rightly know whether to think of Matt as a lord or not. On the other side of the road, he surveyed the burning city, waiting for his men to catch up. He could have mounted all of them. Though they weren't trained cavalry, every man in the band had a horse for long-distance travel. Tonight he didn't dare. With Trollocs and Myrddraal lurking in the streets, Talmanes needed his men in immediate fighting shape. Crossbowmen marched with loaded weapons at the flanks of deep columns of pikemen. He would not leave his soldiers open to a Trolloc charge, no matter how urgent their mission. But if they lost those dragons... Light illuminus, Talmanes thought. The city seemed to be boiling with all that smoke churning above. Yet some parts of the inner city, rising high on the hill and visible over the walls, were not yet aflame. The palace wasn't on fire yet. Could the soldiers there be holding? No word had come from the Queen, and from what Talmanes could see, no help had arrived for the city. The Queen must still be unaware, and that was bad. Very, very bad. Ahead, Talmanes spotted Sandeep with some of the band's scouts. The slender man was trying to extricate himself from a group of refugees. "Please, good master," one young woman was crying. "My child, my daughter, in the heights of the northern march." "I must reach my shop," a stout man bellowed. "My glasswares." "My good people," Talmanes said, forcing his horse among them. "I should think that if you want us to help, you might wish to back away and allow us to reach the bloody city." The refugees reluctantly pulled back, and Sandeep nodded to Talmanes in thanks. Tan-skinned and dark-haired, Sandeep was one of the band's commanders, and an accomplished hedge doctor. The affable man wore a grim expression today, however. "Sandeep," Talmanes said, pointing. "There." In the near distance, a large group of fighting men clustered, looking at the city. "Mercenaries," Sandeep said with a grunt. "We've passed several batches of them. Not a one seemed inclined to lift a finger." "We shall see about that," Talmanes said. People still flooded out through the city gates, coughing, clutching meager possessions, leading crying children. That flow would not soon slacken. Camelin was as full as an inn on market day. The ones lucky enough to be escaping would be only a small fraction compared to those still inside. "Talmanes," Sandeep said quietly, "that city is going to turn into a death trap soon. There aren't enough ways out. If we let the band become pinned inside... I know, but..." At the gates, a wave of feeling surged through the refugees. It was almost a physical thing, a shudder. The screams grew more intense. Talmanes spun. Hulking figures moved in the shadows inside the gate. "Light," Sandeep said. "What is it?" Trollocs, Talmanes said, turning Selphar. Light! They're going to try to seize the gate. Stop the refugees. There were 5 gates out of the city. If the Trollocs held all of them, this was already a slaughter. If the Trollocs could stop the frightened people from fleeing, it would grow far worse. Hurry the ranks, Talmanes yelled. All men to the city gates! He spurred Selphar into a gallop. Talmanes threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding the Trolloc's axe. The ground trembled as the axe broke cobblestones. He ducked and rammed his blade through the creature's thigh. The thing had a bull's snout, and it threw back its head to bellow. "Burn me, but you have horrid breath," Talmanes growled, whipping his sword free and stepping back. The thing went down on one leg, and Talmanes hacked off its weapon hand. Panting, Talmanes danced back as his 2 companions struck the Trolloc through the back with spears. You always wanted to fight Trollocs in a group. Well, you always wanted to fight anyone with a team on your side, but it was more important with Trollocs, considering their size and strength. Corpses lay like heaps of trash in the night. Talmanes had been forced to fire the city gate's guardhouses to give light. The 6 or so guards who had remained were now recruits in the band for the time being. Like a black tide, the Trollocs began to retreat from the gate. They'd overextended themselves in pushing for it, or rather, being pushed for it. There had been a half-man with this crew. Talmanes lowered his hand to the wound in his side. It was wet. The guardhouse fires were burning low. He'd have to order a few of the shops set on fire. That risked letting the blaze spread, but the city was already lost. No sense in holding back now. "Brint!" he yelled. "Set that stable aflame!" Sandeep came up as Brint went running past with a torch. "They'll be back. Soon, probably." Talmanes nodded. Now that the fighting was done, townspeople began to flood out of alleys and recesses, timidly making for the gate and, presumably, safety. "We can't stay here and hold this gate," Sandeep said. "The dragons—" "I know. How many men did we lose?" "I don't have a count yet. 100 at least." Light, Matt's going to have my hide when he hears about that. Matt hated losing troops. There was a softness to the man equal to his genius, an odd but inspiring combination. "Send some scouts to watch the city roadways nearby for approaching shadow spawn. Heap some of those Trolloc carcasses to make barriers. They'll work as well as anything else." "You, soldier!" One of the wearied soldiers walking past froze. He wore the Queen's colors. "My lord?" "We need to let people know this gate out of the city is safe. Is there a horn call that Anderan peasants would recognize? Something that would bring them here?" "Peasants?" the man said thoughtfully. He didn't seem to like the word. They didn't use it often here in Andor. "Yes, the Queen's March." "Sandeep?" "I'll set the Sunders to it, Talmanes," Sandeep said. "Good." Talmanes knelt to clean his sword on a fallen Trolloc's shirt, his side aching. The wound wasn't bad. Not by normal terms. Just a nick, really. The shirt was so grimy he almost hesitated to wipe his weapon. But Trolloc blood was bad for a blade, so he swabbed down the sword. He stood up, ignoring the pain to his side, then walked toward the gate where he'd tied Selphar. He hadn't dared trust the horse against shadow spawn. He was a good gelding, but not borderland trained. None of the men questioned him as he climbed into the saddle and turned Selphar westward out of the city gate, toward those mercenaries he'd been watching earlier. Talmanes wasn't surprised to find that they'd moved closer to the city. Fighting drew warriors like fire drawing cold travelers on a winter night. They hadn't joined in the battle. As Talmanes rode up, he was greeted by a small group of the sellswords. 6 men with thick arms, and likely thick wits. They recognized him in the band. Matt was downright famous these days, and so was the band by association. They undoubtedly also noticed the Trolloc bloodstains on Talmanes's clothing and the bandage at his side. That wound had really begun to burn fiercely now. Talmanes reined in Selfar, then patiently patted at his saddlebags. "I stowed some tobacco here somewhere." "Well?" one of the mercenaries asked. The leader was easy to pick out. He had the finest armor. A man often became leader of a band like this by staying alive. Talmanes fished his second-best pipe out of his saddlebag. Where was that tobacco? He never took the best pipe into battle. His father had called that bad luck. "Ah," he thought, pulling out the tobacco pouch. He placed some in the bowl, then removed a lighting twig and leaned over to stick it into a torch held by a wary mercenary. "We aren't going to fight unless paid," the leader said. He was a stout man, surprisingly clean, though he could have done with a beard trim. Talmanes lit his pipe, puffing smoke out. Behind him, the horns started blowing. The Queen's March turned out to be a catchy tune. The horns were accompanied by shouts, and Talmanes turned back. Trollocs on the main thoroughfare, a larger batch this time. Crossbowmen fell into ranks and began loosing at an order Talmanes couldn't hear. "We're not," the headman began again. "Do you know what this is?" Talmanes asked softly around his pipe. "This is the beginning of the end. This is the fall of nations and the unification of humankind. This is the last battle, you bloody fool!" The men shuffled uncomfortably. Do you speak for the Queen?" the leader said, trying to salvage something. "I just want to see my men taken care of." "If you fight," Talmanes said, "I'll promise you a great reward." The man waited. "I promise you that you'll continue to draw breath," Talmanes said, taking another puff. "Is that a threat, Kyrianin?" Talmanes blew out smoke, then leaned down from his saddle, putting his face closer to the leader. "I killed a Myrddraal tonight, Anderin," he said softly. "It nicked me with a Thakandar blade, and the wound has gone black. It means I have a few hours at best before the blade's poison burns me from the inside out, and I die in the most agonizing way a man can. Therefore, friend, I suggest that you trust me when I tell you that I really have nothing to lose." The man blinked. "You have two choices," Talmanes said, turning his horse and speaking loudly to the troop. "You can fight like the rest of us and help this world see new days, and maybe you'll earn some coin in the end. I can't promise that. Your other option is to sit here, watch people be slaughtered, and tell yourselves that you don't work for free. If you're lucky, and the rest of us salvage this world without you, you'll draw breath long enough to be strung up by your cowardly necks." Silence. Horns blew from the darkness behind. The chief sellsword looked toward his companions. They nodded in agreement. "Go help hold that gate," Talmanes said, turning his horse. "I'll recruit the other mercenary bands to help." "It's part of an old borderlander relief for the pain," Milton said, removing the bandage at Talmanes' side. "The blister leaf slows the taint left by the cursed metal." Milton was a lean, mop-haired man. He was dressed like an Anderin woodsman with a simple shirt and cloak, but he spoke like a borderlander. In his pouch he carried a set of colored balls that he'd sometimes juggle for the other members of the band. In another life he must have been a gleeman. He was an unlikely man to be in the band, but they all were, in one way or another. "I don't know how it dampens the poison," Milton said, "but it does. It's no natural poison, mind you. You can't suck it free." Talmanes pressed his hand to the side. The burning pain felt like thorny vines crawling in under his skin, creeping forward and tearing at his flesh with every movement. He could feel the poison moving through his body. Light, but it hurt. Nearby, the men of the band fought through Caemlyn up toward the palace. They'd come in through the southern gate, leaving the mercenary bands, under Sandeep's command, holding the western gate. If there was human resistance anywhere in the city, it would be at the palace. Unfortunately, fists of Trollocs roved the area between Talmanes' position and the palace. They kept running across the monsters and getting drawn into fights. Talmanes couldn't find out if indeed there was resistance above without getting there. That meant leading his men up toward the palace, fighting all the way, and leaving himself open to being cut off from behind if one of those roving groups worked around behind him. There was nothing for it, though. He needed to find out what, if anything, remained of the palace defenses. From there he could strike further into the city and try to get the dragons. The air smelled of smoke and blood. During a brief pause in the fighting, they'd piled dead Trollocs against the right side of the street to make room for passage. There were refugees in this quarter of the city too, though not a flood of them. A stream, maybe, seeping in from the darkness as Talmanes and the band seized sections of the thoroughfare leading up toward the palace. These refugees never demanded that the band protect their goods or rescue their homes. They sobbed with joy at finding human resistance. Madwyn was in charge of sending them toward freedom along the corridor of safety the band had carved free. Talmanes turned up toward the palace atop the hill, but only barely visible in the night. Though most of the city burned, the palace was not aflame. Its white walls hung in the smoky night like phantoms. No fire. That had to indicate resistance, didn't it? Wouldn't the Trollocs have attacked it as one of their first actions in the city? He'd sent scouts along the street up ahead as he gave his men, and himself, a short breather. Melton finished tying Talmanes' poultice tight. "Thank you, Melton," Talmanes said, nodding to the man. "I can feel the poultice working already. You said this is part of the cure for the pain. What is the other part?" Melton unhooked a metal flask from his belt and handed it over. "Shinaran brandy. Full strength. It's not a good idea to drink in combat, man." "Take it," Melton said softly. "Keep the flask and drink it deep, my lord. Or come the next bell, you won't be standing." Talmanes hesitated, then took the flask and took a long swallow. It burned like the wound. He coughed, then tucked the brandy away. "I believe you mistook your bottles, Melton. That was something you found in a tanning vat." Melton snorted. "And it's said you have no sense of humor, Lord Talmanes." "I haven't one," Talmanes said. "Stay close with that sword of yours." Melton nodded, eyes solemn. "Dreadbane," he whispered. "What's that?" "Borderlander title. You slew a Fade. Dreadbane. It had about 17 bolts in it at the time. Doesn't matter." Melton clasped him on the shoulder. "Dreadbane. When you can't take the pain any longer, make 2 fists and raise them toward me. I will see the deed done." Talmanes stood up, unable to suppress a groan. They both understood. The several Borderlanders in the band agreed. Wounds taken by a Thakandar blade were unpredictable. Some festered fast, others made men sick. When one went black like Talmanes's, though, that was the worst. Nothing short of finding an Aes Sedai in the next few hours could save him. "See," Talmanes muttered, "it is a good thing I have no sense of humor. Otherwise I should think the pattern was playing a joke on me." "Denel, you have a map handy?" Light, but he missed Bannon. "My lord," Denel said, hurrying across the dark street carrying a torch and a hastily drawn map. He was one of the band's dragon captains. "I think we've found a faster way through the streets to where Aludra had the dragons stored." "We're fighting to the palace first," Talmanes said. "My lord," Denel's words came more softly from his wide lips. He was picking at his uniform as if it didn't fit right. "If the shadow reaches those dragons—" "I'm well aware of the dangers, Denel, thank you. How fast could you move the things, assuming we reach them? I'm worried about extending ourselves too far, and this city is going up faster than oil-soaked love letters to a High Lord's mistress. I want to get the weapons and leave the city as quickly as possible." "I can level an enemy bulwark in a shot or two, my lord, but the dragons do not move quickly. They are attached to carts, so that will help, but they aren't going to be any faster than, say, a line of supply wagons, and they would take time to set up properly and fire." "Then we continue to the palace," Talmanes said. "But at the palace," he said sternly, "we might find women who can channel us a gateway straight to Eludra's warehouse. Besides, if we find the palace guard still fighting, we know we have a friend at our backs. We will retrieve those dragons, but we'll do it smartly." He noticed Ladwin and Mar hurriedly coming down from above. "There are Trollocs up there," Mar said, hastening up to Talmanes. 100 strong at least, hunkered down in the street. "Form ranks, men," Talmanes shouted. "We push for the palace." Talmanes threw his shoulder against a hulking boar-faced Trolloc in crude chain armor. The beast smelled horrid, like smoke, wet fur, and unwashed flesh. It grunted at the force of Talmanes' assault. The things always seemed surprised when he attacked them. Talmanes pulled back, ripping his sword out of the beast's side as it collapsed. He then lunged forward and rammed his sword into its throat, heedless of its ragged fingernails scratching at his legs. Life faded from the beady, too human eyes. Men fought, called, grunted, killed. The street ran up a steep incline toward the palace. Trolloc hordes had entrenched here, holding position and keeping the band from reaching the top. Talmanes sagged against the side of a building. The one next to it was on fire, lighting the street with violent colors and bathing him in heat. Those fires seemed chilly compared to the flaring horrible pain of his wound. The flare ran down his leg to his foot and was beginning to work its way across his shoulder. Blood and bloody ashes, he thought. What I'd give for another few hours with my pipe and book, alone and peaceful. The people who spoke of glorious death in battle were complete flaming fools. There was nothing glorious about dying in this mess of fire and blood. Give him a quiet death any day. Talmanes pushed himself back up to his feet, drops of sweat falling from his face. Below, Trollocs amassed themselves behind his rear position. They had closed the road behind Talmanes' force, but Talmanes was able to proceed, cutting through the Trollocs ahead. Retreat would be difficult to pull off. As well as this roadway being full of Trollocs, fighting in the city meant that Trollocs could wind through the streets in small groups and attack his flanks as they advanced and later when they retreated. "Throw everything you've got at them, men!" he bellowed, hurling himself up the street and into the Trollocs blocking the way up. The palace was quite close now. He caught a goat-faced Trolloc's sword on his shield right before it would have taken off Denel's head. Talmanes tried to shove the beast's weapon back, but light Trollocs were strong. Talmanes barely kept this one from throwing him to the ground as Denel recovered and attacked its thighs, bringing it down. Melton fell in beside Talmanes. The Borderlander was true to his word to stay close, in case Talmanes needed a sword to end his life. The two led the push up the hill. The Trollocs began to give, then rallied, a snarling, roaring heap of dark fur, eyes and weapons in the firelight. There were so many of them. "Steady!" Talmanes yelled. "For Lord Mat and the Band of the Red Hand!" If Mat were here, he would probably curse a lot, complain as much, then proceed to save them all with some battlefield miracle. Talmanes couldn't reproduce Mat's blend of insanity and inspiration, but his yell did seem to encourage the men. The ranks tightened. Gavid arrayed his 24 crossbowmen, the last Talmanes had with him, atop a building that hadn't burned away. They started driving flight after flight of bolts into the Trollocs. That might have broken human enemies, but not Trollocs. The bolts dropped a few, but not as many as Talmanes would have hoped. There's another fade back there, Talmanes thought, pushing them forward. Light, I can't fight another. I shouldn't have fought the one I did. He shouldn't be on his feet. Melton's flask of brandy was gone, long since drained to deaden what it could. His mind was already as fuzzy as he dared allow. He fell in with Denel and Landrade at the front, fighting, concentrating, letting Trolloc blood out onto the cobbles to stream down the hillside. The band gave a good fight of it, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. Down below, another Trolloc fist joined the ones on the street behind him. That was it. He would have to either hit that force behind, turning his back on the one in front, or break his men into smaller units and send them retreating through side streets to regroup at the gate below. Talmanes prepared to give the orders.
"Forward the White Lion!" voices yelled. "For Andor and the Queen!"
Talmanes spun as men in white and red broke through the Trolloc lines atop the hill. A second force of Andoran pikemen poured out of a side alleyway, coming in behind the Trolloc horde that had just surrounded him. The Trollocs broke before the oncoming pikemen, and in moments the entire mass, like a pus-filled blister, burst, Trollocs scattering in all directions. Talmanes stumbled back. Momentarily he had to prop himself up with his sword as Madwyn took command of the counterstrike, and his men killed many of the fleeing Trollocs. A group of officers in bloodied Queen's Guard uniforms rushed down the hillside. They didn't look any better than the band. Gaibon led them.
"Mercenary,"
he said to Talmanes,
"I thank you for showing up."
Talmanes frowned.
"You act as if we saved you. From my perspective, it happened the other way around."
Gaibon grimaced in the firelight.
"You gave us some respite. Those Trollocs were attacking the palace gates. I apologize for taking so long to reach you. We didn't realize at first what had drawn them in this direction."
"Right. The palace still stands?"
"Yes," Gaibon said. "We're full of refugees, though."
"What of channelers?" Talmanes asked, hopeful.
"Why haven't the Andoran armies returned with the Queen?"
"Dark friends," Gaibon frowned.
"Her Majesty took most of the kinswomen with her. The strongest ones, at least. She left 4 with enough power to make a gateway together, but the attack... An assassin killed 2 of them before the other 2 could stop him. Alone, the 2 aren't strong enough to send for help. They're using their strength to heal."
"Blood and bloody ashes," Talmanes said, though he felt a stab of hope as he said it. Perhaps these women could not make a gateway, but they might be able to heal his wound.
"You should lead the refugees out of the city, Gaibon. My men hold the southern gate."
"Excellent," Gaibon said, straightening.
"But you will have to lead the refugees. I must defend the palace."
Talmanes raised an eyebrow at him. He didn't take orders from Gaibon. The band had its own command structure and reported only to the Queen. Matt had made that clear when accepting the contract. Unfortunately, Gaibon didn't take orders from Talmanes either. Talmanes took a deep breath, but then wavered, dizzy. Melton grabbed his arm to keep him from toppling over. Light, but it hurt. Couldn't his side just do the decent thing and grow numb? Blood and bloody ashes. He needed to get to those kinswomen. Talmanes said hopefully,
"Those 2 women who can heal?"
"I have sent for them already," Gaibon said, "as soon as we saw this force here." Well, that was something.
"I do mean to stay here," Gaibon warned. "I won't abandon this post."
"Why? The city is lost, man."
"The Queen ordered us to send regular reports through gateways," Gaibon said. "Eventually she's going to wonder why we haven't sent a messenger. She will send a channeler to see why we haven't reported, and that messenger will arrive at the palace's traveling grounds. My lord!" a voice called. "My Lord Talmanes!"
Gaibon cut off, and Talmanes turned to find Filger, one of the scouts, scrambling up the bloodied cobbles of the hillside toward him. Filger was a lean man, with thinning hair and a couple of days' worth of scruff, and the sight of him filled Talmanes with dread. Filger was one of those they'd left guarding the city gate below.
"My lord," Filger said, panting, "the Trollocs have taken the city walls. They're packing the ramparts, loosing arrows or spears at anyone who draws too close. Lieutenant Sundeep sent me to bring you word."
"Blood and ashes. What of the gate?"
"We're holding," Filger said. "For now."
"Gaibon," Talmanes said, turning back. "Show some mercy, man. Someone needs to defend that gate.
Please take the refugees out and reinforce my men. That gate will be our only method of retreat from the city." "But the Queen's messenger—" "The Queen will figure out what bloody happened once she thinks to look here. Look about you. Trying to defend the palace is madness. You don't have a city any longer, but a pyre."
Gaibon's face was conflicted, his lips a tight line.
"You know I'm right,"
Talmanes said, his face twisted in pain.
"The best thing you can do is reinforce my men at the southern gate to hold it open for as many refugees as can reach it."
"Perhaps," Gaibon said.
"But to let the palace burn?" "You can make it worth something," Talmanes said. "What if you left some soldiers to fight at the palace? Have them hold off the Trollocs as long as they can. That will draw the Trollocs away from the people escaping out this way. When they can hold no longer, your soldiers can escape to palace grounds on the far side and hopefully make their way around to the southern gate."
"A good plan," Gaibon said grudgingly.
"I will do as you suggest. But what of you?" "I have to get to the dragons," Talmanes said. "We can't let them fall to the shadow. They're in a warehouse near the edge of the inner city. The Queen wanted them kept out of sight, away from the mercenary bands outside. I have to find them. If possible, retrieve them. If not, destroy them."
"Very well," Gaibon said, turning away, looking frustrated as he accepted the inevitable.
"My men will do as you suggest. Half will lead the refugees out, then help your soldiers hold the southern gate. The other half will hold the palace a little longer, then withdraw. But I'm coming with you."
Talmanes lay on his back, staring up at a dark sky. The clouds above seemed to be reflecting light from below, the light of a dying city. That was wrong. Light came from above, didn't it? He'd fallen from the horse not long after starting for the city gate. He could remember that, most of the time. Pain made it hard to think. People yelled at one another. I should have taunted Matt more, he thought, a hint of a smile cracking his lips. Stupid time to be thinking of such things. I have to find the dragons. Or did we find them already?
"I'm telling you, the bloody things don't work like that."
Denel's voice.
"They're not bloody Aes Sedai on wheels. We can't make a wall of fire. We can send these balls of metal hurtling through the Trollocs." "They explode," Gaibon's voice. "We could use the extras like I say."
Talmanes' eyes drifted closed.
"The balls explode, yes," Denel said. "But we have to launch them first. Setting them all in a row and letting the Trollocs run over them won't do much."
A hand shook Talmanes' shoulder.
"Lord Talmanes," Melton said, "there is no dishonor in letting it end now. I know the pain is great. May the last embrace of the mother shelter you."
A sword being drawn. Talmanes steeled himself. Then he found that he really, really didn't want to die. He forced his eyes open and held up a hand to Melton, who stood over him. Jessamine hovered nearby with arms folded, looking worried.
"Help me to my feet," Talmanes said.
Melton hesitated, then did so.
"You shouldn't be standing," Jessamine said.
"Better than being beheaded in honor," Talmanes grumbled, gritting his teeth against the pain. Light, was that his hand? It was so dark. It looked as if it had been charred in a fire.
What is going on?"
"We're cornered, my lord," Melton said grimly, eyes solemn. He thought them all as good as dead.
"Denel and Gaibon are arguing over placement of the dragons for a last stand. Eludra is measuring the charges."
Talmanes, finally standing, sagged against Melton. Before him, 2,000 people clustered in the center of a large city square. They huddled like men in the wilderness, seeking one another's warmth on a cold night. Denel and Gaibon had set up the dragons in a half-circle, bowed outward, pointing toward the center of the city, refugees behind. The band was now committed to manning the dragons. 3 pairs of hands were needed to operate each weapon. Almost all of the band had had at least some training. The buildings nearby had caught fire, but the light was doing strange things. Why didn't it reach the streets? Those were all too dark. As if they'd been painted. Like... He blinked, clearing the tears of pain from his eyes, realization dawning. Trollocs filled the streets like ink flowing toward the half-circle of dragons that were pointed at them. Something held the Trollocs back for the moment. They're waiting until they are all together for a rush, Talmanes thought. Calls and snarls came from behind. Talmanes turned, then clutched Melton's arm as the world lurched. He waited for it to steady. The pain was actually dulling, like glowing flames running out of fresh coal. It had feasted upon him, but there wasn't much left of him for it to eat. As things steadied, Talmanes saw what was creating the snarls. The square they were in adjoined the city wall, but the townspeople and soldiers had kept their distance from the wall, for it was coated with Trollocs like a thick grime. They raised weapons in the air and roared down at the people. "They throw down spears at anyone who comes too close," Melton said. "We'd been hoping to reach the wall, then follow it along to the gate, but we can't. Not with those things up there raining death upon us. All other routes are cut off." Aludra approached Gaibon and Denel. "Charges I can set under the dragons," she said to them, softly, but not as softly as she should have. "These charges, they will destroy the weapons. They may hurt the people in an unpleasant way." "Do it," Gaibon said very softly. "What the Trollocs would do is worse, and we cannot allow the dragons to fall into the Shadow's hands. That's why they are waiting. Their leaders are hoping that a sudden rush will give them time to overwhelm us and seize the weapons." "They're moving," a soldier called from beside the dragons. "Light, they're coming!" That dark slime of shadow spawn bubbled down the streets. Teeth, nails, claws, 2 human eyes. The Trollocs came from all sides, eager for the kill. Talmanes struggled to draw breath. On the walls, the calls grew excited. "We're surrounded," Talmanes thought. "Pressed back against the wall, caught in a net. Pressed back against the wall." "Denel!" Talmanes shouted over the din. The captain of the dragons turned from his line, where men waited with burning punks for the call to launch the one volley they'd have. Talmanes took a deep breath that made his lungs burn. "You told me that you could level an enemy bulwark in only a few shots." "Of course," Denel called. "But we're not trying to enter—" He trailed off. Light, Talmanes thought. We're all so exhausted we should have seen this. "You, in the middle, Raiden's dragon squad. About face!" Talmanes screamed. "The rest of you, stay in position and fire at the oncoming Trollocs. Move, move, move!" The dragoners sprang into motion, Raiden and his men hastily turning their weapons about, wheels creaking. The other dragons began to fire a pattern of shot that sprayed across the entire square. The booms were deafening, causing refugees to scream and cover their ears. It sounded like the end of the world. Hundreds, thousands of Trollocs went down in pools of blood as dragons' eggs exploded in their midst. The square filled with white smoke that poured from the mouths of the dragons. The refugees behind, already terrified by what they had just witnessed, shrieked as Raiden's dragons turned on them, and most of them fell to the ground in fright, clearing a path that exposed the Trolloc-infested city wall. Raiden's line of dragons bowed inward like a cup, the reverse formation of those firing into the Trollocs behind, so that the tubes were pointed at the same section of city wall. "Give me one of those bloody punks!" Talmanes shouted, holding out a hand. One of the dragoners obeyed, passing him a flaming brand with a glowing red tip. He pushed away from Melton, determined to stand on his own for the moment. Gaibon stepped up. The man's voice sounded soft to Talmanes' strained ears. "Those walls have stood for hundreds of years. My poor city. My poor, poor city." "It's not your city any longer," Talmanes said, raising his flaming brand high in the air, defiant before a wall thick with Trollocs, a burning city to his back.
"It's theirs."
Talmanes swiped the brand down in the air, leaving a trail of red. His signal ignited a roar of dragon fire that echoed throughout the square. Trollocs, pieces of them at least, blew into the air. The wall under them exploded like a stack of children's blocks kicked at a full run. As Talmanes wavered, his vision blackening, he saw the wall crumble outward around the hole. When he toppled, slipping into unconsciousness, the ground seemed to tremble from the force of his fall.
"Caemlyn is under attack, Your Majesty," the woman said, gasping for breath. "What?" Elaine leaped to her feet. "How? Did Jared Sarand finally—" "Trollocs," the messenger said. "It started near dusk." "Impossible," Elaine said, grabbing the messenger by the arm and hauling her out of the tent. Egwene followed hastily. "It's been over 6 hours since dusk," Elaine said to the messenger. "Why haven't we heard anything until now? What happened to the kinswomen?" "I was not told, my queen," the messenger said. "Captain Gaibon sent me to fetch you at speed. He just arrived through the gateway." The traveling ground was not far from Elaine's tent. A crowd had gathered, but men and women made way for the Amyrlin and the queen. In moments, the two of them reached the front. A group of men in bloodied clothing trudged through the open gateway, pulling carts laden with Elaine's new weapons, the dragons. Many of the men seemed near collapse. They smelled of smoke, and their skin was blackened by soot. Not a few of them slumped unconscious as Elaine's soldiers grabbed the carts, which were obviously meant for horses to pull, to help them. Other gateways opened nearby, as Serenia Sedai and some of the stronger of the kinswomen, Egwene wouldn't think of them as Elaine's kinswomen, created them. Refugees poured through like the waters of a suddenly unstopped river. "Go," Egwene said to Gawain, weaving her own gateway, one to the traveling grounds and the White Tower camp nearby. "Send for as many Aes Sedai as we can rouse. Tell Bryn to ready his soldiers. Tell them to do as Elaine orders and send them through gateways to the outskirts of Caemlyn. We will show solidarity with Andor." Gawain nodded, ducking through the gateway. Egwene let it vanish, then joined Elaine near the gathering of wounded, confused soldiers. Sumiko, of the kinswomen, had taken charge of seeing that healing was given to those in immediate danger. The air was thick with the smell of smoke. As Egwene hurried to Elaine, she caught sight of something through one of the gateways. Caemlyn afire. Light! She stood stunned for a moment, and hurried on. Elaine was speaking with Gaibon, commander of the Queen's Guard. The handsome man seemed barely able to remain on his feet, his clothing and arms alarmingly bloodied. "Dark friends killed 2 of the women you left to send messages, Your Majesty," he was saying in a tired voice. "Another fell in the fighting, but we retrieved the dragons. Once we escaped." He seemed pained by something. "Once we escaped through the hole in the city wall, we found that several mercenary bands were making their way around the city toward the gate that Lord Talmanes had left defended. By coincidence, they were near enough to aid in our escape." "You did well," Elaine said. "But the city—" "You did well," Elaine repeated, voice firm. "You retrieved the dragons and rescued all of these people? I will see you rewarded for this, Captain." "Give your reward to the men of the band, Your Majesty. It was their work. And please, if you can do anything for Lord Talmanes—" He gestured to the fallen man whom several members of the band had just carried through the gateway. Elaine knelt beside him, and Egwene joined her. At first, Egwene assumed that Talmanes was dead, with his skin blackened. Then he drew a ragged breath. "Light," Elaine said, delving his prostrate form. I've never seen anything like this. Thakandar blades, Gaibon said. This is beyond either of us, Egwene said to Elaine, standing. She trailed off, hearing something over the groans of soldiers and carts creaking. Egwene? Elaine asked softly. Do what you can for him, Egwene said, standing and rushing away. She pushed through the confused crowd, following the voice. Was that? Yes. There! She found an open gateway at the edge of the traveling grounds, Aes Sedai in a variety of clothing hurrying through to see to the wounded. Gawain had done his work well. Nynaeve was asking, quite loudly, who was in charge of this mess. Egwene approached her from the side and grabbed her by the shoulder, surprising her. Mother? Nynaeve asked. What is this about Caemlyn burning? She cut off as she saw the wounded. She stiffened, then tried to go to them. There is one you need to see first, Egwene said, leading her to where Talmanes lay. Nynaeve drew in a sharp breath, then went to her knees and pushed Elaine gently aside. Nynaeve delved Talmanes, then froze, eyes wide. Nynaeve, Egwene said, can you... An explosion of weaves burst from Nynaeve, like the sudden light of a sun coming out from behind clouds. Nynaeve wove the 5 powers together in a column of radiance, then sent it driving into Talmanes' body. Egwene left her to her work. Perhaps it would be enough, though he looked far gone. The light willing, the man would live. She had been impressed with him in the past. He seemed precisely the type of man that the band and Matt needed. Egwene returned to Nynaeve, who still knelt beside Talmanes. The sickness had retreated from the man's skin, leaving it pale. Take him somewhere to rest, Nynaeve said tiredly to several watching members of the band. I've done what I can. She looked up at Egwene as the men carried him away. Light, Nynaeve whispered. That took a lot out of me, even with my Angreal. I'm impressed that Moiraine managed it with Tom all that time ago. There seemed to be a note of pride in Nynaeve's voice. She had wanted to heal Tom, but could not, though of course Nynaeve had not known what she had been doing at the time. She had come a long, long way since then. Is it true, Mother? Nynaeve asked, rising. About Caemlyn? Egwene nodded. This is going to be a long night, Nynaeve said, looking at the wounded still pouring through the gateways. And a longer tomorrow, Egwene said. Here, let us link. I'll lend you my strength. Nynaeve looked shocked. Mother? You are better at healing than I, Egwene smiled. I may be Amyrlin, Nynaeve, but I'm still Aes Sedai, servant of all. My strength will be of use to you. Nynaeve nodded, and they linked. The two of them joined the group of Aes Sedai that Ramonda had set healing the refugees with the worst wounds.
Hello, everybody. Game Killer Daddy here, and welcome to my new mini-series of The Wheel of Time. What I'll be doing is taking some of my favorite parts, and hopefully some of you guys' favorite parts too, special events or parts from the book that really stuck out in my mind or that I just loved, that I can't wait to get to when I start reading them, and making little clips and putting it out there for you guys of those specific parts throughout the whole Wheel of Time series. The book was written by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. I'll be taking clips from the audiobooks read by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding. They do an excellent job. If you've never listened to the audiobooks and you're a Wheel of Time fan, you should definitely give it a go, give it a listen. They have different voices for everybody. You know which character is talking, you know what's going on, who's saying what. You're not lost. Who's that? Or, who said that? You know each character. They do an excellent job. I have nothing to do whatsoever with the Wheel of Time or the embodiment of the Wheel of Time or any entity having anything to do with the Wheel of Time. I'm doing this because, well, for two reasons. One, that I really love the Wheel of Time series, and I need to hopefully get more subscribers since YouTube changed their policy. But I hope all of y'all like this as well. If there's anybody out there that likes to draw Wheel of Time stuff, I'll leave an email down in the description that you can send it to. Just put in the subject, what it's about or which character it is: Lan, Nynaeve, Rand, Cadswain, anything. That way, if I'm doing a special clip on, a certain character, I can go and quickly find any artwork you guys send for that character or event. And if there's a special part from any of the books that you guys would like me to get to first or like me to do, please leave a comment down below. Let me know. I'll be happy to do it. I may even say, hey, this is for so-and-so. So please hit that subscribe button. It really helps us out. If you like the videos or audio video clips, give it a thumbs up and hit that little bell so you'll be alerted the next time I put out one of these or anything else put out by the Game Killers. And thank you for all your support.
Game